informal or formal observations or from some theory, and usually with the goal of trying to support a theory or maybe establish a theory. We're going to test that hypothesis. We have to determine how we're going to measure our variables of interest, whatever those variables may be. And then we have to collect that data in a particular fashion to help us answer the question. So if you remember, if it's a cause-effect kind of question we're trying to answer, or a cause-effect hypothesis, then that would require an experimental design. If it's some other kind of hypothesis, then we would go a different direction. Then we analyze the data that we have collected, and we make some decision about the hypothesis. Is the hypothesis supported or is it not supported? And then, of course, depending on that outcome, we move into dissemination. We write up a report, we publish it, we let other people know about it, other people react to it. It becomes a part of the body of literature, and hopefully adds to our understanding of a particular phenomenon. Generally speaking, we're not going to be able to prove or disprove a particular theory with one hypothesis or one study, but we add to the support. We add to the body of understanding. All right? Okay. There we go. Dissemination, publication. Okay, and then we talked about the different types of research, went through these cases. Okay, what I wanted to do today then is talk a little bit about how we evaluate research that's been conducted. What are some of the things that we need to look at? And this actually will also feed into design of the research, which I've just kind of skipped over some things, but some things that we look at. So you're given a study to read, a study to review. How do you decide if it's meeting its goals or not? Well, there's a couple of criteria to take into account. The first one doesn't always apply. The second one pretty much always does. All right, the first one there is generalizability. So what we mean by that is, do the results of my study apply beyond the subjects that I used? All right, so think about the study that we did on seat preference. And if you remember, the hypothesis saying that there is a relationship maybe between personality and seat preference did seem to be supported. Now, the question is that conclusion that I've reached generalizable? Meaning, it worked for this group of students in my two sections of Psych 111, would it apply beyond you? And if not, why not? So what do you think about that? How generalizable are the results of our little in-class study? Excuse me.
I think at least in regards to like college students at BYUI, it's probably pretty generalizable, and maybe even just college students in America, but I don't know about like college students outside of America.
Okay.
Students outside of college.
Yeah. Well, that's the point, right? Can we take it beyond this group? I think you're right. I think we could say that maybe it applies, maybe to BYUI students. You could make that argument, and I think we make the. But let's what's what we're looking for. Let's break that down just a little bit. So it was Alec. Alec said that this probably would apply to BYUI students in general, maybe. Why would it? What's the logic behind that? Why would we be able to say, yeah, probably maybe would apply to BYUI students, but not apply to maybe students outside of BYUI? Any thoughts?
My input would be that we're all from similar backgrounds, some of us. So our answers are going to be somewhat similar. Okay,
you can certainly make that argument. I mean, this is an institution that is designed for members of the LDS Church, right? So yeah, you all come from, even if you are a convert to the church, even if you come from a different country, there are still some similarities amongst us all. So on that basis, yeah, we could say, all right, so why might it be challenging to go outside of the boundaries of BYUI with the results of our study? What would some people argue?
Well, everyone that we tested was just here at BYU Idaho.
Okay.
So you can't really say for anywhere else because the control group was just here.
Well, we
It's
didn't
just-
really. Keep going. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
No, I was going to say we didn't really have a control group per se, right? Because we didn't do an experimental design, if you remember. But you're right in saying that's probably not going to apply to these other college students at other institutions. And again, can we articulate that a little bit more? What's the problem with me trying to take my results and say, hey, they're going to apply to students at Stanford University and students at the University of Utah and students at Montana State University? I mean,
It's a logical fallacy, right? It's just overgeneralization.
Yeah, well, it is. It is a fallacy to assume that the qualities that make up the student body at BYUI, which, come on, is a unique student body, are going to be elsewhere. Yeah, you're all going to be in the right age range, right? But some of you, for example, are married. There's not a lot of college students at your particular age group that are married. Some of you have kids. Some of you, again, everybody comes from a religious background. Those are all things that make you quite unique in terms of college students. So that's a problem. So even though I might be able to claim some generalizability, it wouldn't be too hard to tear that claim apart by saying, all right, well, you did this with a bunch of BYUI students. Is that really going to be what you get? Well, maybe it will be, but it's not really defensible. All right. So again, the problem is not being able to defend the conclusion if I'm making that particular claim. So that's what we mean by generalizability. Okay, I'm going to come back to that idea in just a moment. Now, internal validity. What we mean by internal validity really is that the relationship that we have discovered really exists and there is no alternative explanation. Okay, that's what we mean by internal validity, meaning that, now, for example, I concluded that there is a relationship between personality and seat preference. Okay, if that is an internally valid statement, what that means is that there is no other explanation that would account for that relationship. Now, remember, with correlation, which is kind of what we did, there is always a possibility of some third variable. So when I say that there is a relationship between your personality, be you extroverted or introverted or ambiverted, and where you would choose to sit in the class, I'm saying that's really a relationship that exists. And there's no other reason for it. Okay. So anyway, we'll get more into that issue in a moment. But think about this. Whenever you look at a study, one of the questions you should ask yourself along with the generalizability issue is there some other probable accounting for the results that they got that have nothing to do with the hypothesis that they claim? If they've done their study well, the chances of that are slim. If it's a poorly designed study, then the chances really increase. All right, well, we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But let's talk about generalizability. There are actually some things you can do to improve your generalizability. And this has to do with what we call sampling. And what we mean by sampling is, where do you get your subjects from? Where do you get your research participants from? How do you get them? Now, one of the best ways to get a study that's going to be somewhat generalizable is through random sampling. And what we mean by random sampling is that all possible members of a particular population have an opportunity to be in the study. All right. So if I am claiming that my conclusion about personality and seat preference is generalizable, then what I would have to be able to show is that, to all college students, yes, this is actually statistical, but we're not going to get into too many statistics, but this is a statistical thing. But anyway, I'm going to say that all college students in the United States, if that's my population I'm generalizing to, all had an opportunity to be in my study, which is not true, right? Because very few of them actually had an opportunity. But that was what it would mean. So if I really wanted to do random sampling, what I would have to do is I would have to go out and find in a random sort of way students from different universities. And they talk about, you can do that like drawing names out of a hat. Let's say that I had a really, really big hat and I put all the names of all college students in the United States. I don't know how many thousands that is, probably tons. But then I would reach in and just randomly pick out the students who are going to be in my study. Ding, 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 ding. There they are. There's my participant pool. All right, that's random sampling. And if I do that right, then my results can be generalizable. Now, this is the logic behind a lot of polls. We just had, in the United States at least, last fall, we went through a presidential election. And if you were following that at all, there was lots of polls that went on trying to, predict who was going to win in different states and generally. And the approach that many of these pollsters used was a kind of random sampling approach, as much as they could. A lot of the surveys that were done were phone surveys. That's problematic in these days because not everybody has a landline and lots of people have cell phones and it's hard to get a hold of cell phone numbers. But the idea was, let's find a general representation of the population and see if we can then use their answers to tell us, who's going to win in this state or who's going to win in the country, right? But that's random sampling. You can draw those conclusions about the entire group if you've selected randomly a subset of that group. Now, it does require a complete list of every person in the population that you're trying to generalize to. So if I'm trying to generalize to college students, then I need all college students. If I'm trying to generalize to all female Catholic housewives, then I need the name of all female that's kind of redundant, isn't it? I need the name of all Catholic housewives. If I'm trying to generalize to the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, then I need the names of all CEOs of Fortune 500 companies so I can, again, pull them out randomly and include them in my study. Now, there is a kind of a variation on random sampling that's called systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, you don't necessarily pick out randomly from the hat. You kind of count off on the elements. So let's say I wanted to do my study with all of the college students at BYUI. And actually it is possible for me to get a list of all the names of all college students at BYUI. It would be a very long list, but I could get that. And I would have this long list. And what I could do then is, instead of just randomly picking, like again, drawing the names out of a hat, I could just say, I'm going to pick every fifth person. Right? That's systematic sampling. Every fifth person, ding, 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 and I include them in my study. Now, that's not as justifiable in terms of generalizability as random sampling is, but it's still decent. And so that allows us to still draw some conclusions about how generalizable the results I get are. So again, think of systematic sampling as just a kind of a variation on random sampling. With random sampling, you are really, truly randomly selecting, again, names out of the hat. Systematic sampling, well, you now have a scheme for selecting people. Every fifth person, every 10th person, every 12th person on the list becomes part of that. And again, you could still argue a little bit about the generalizability. Now, the third one there is the one that is most commonly used in psychological studies, and that is convenience sampling. Okay, convenience sampling is very easy to do because it just simply means you grab who you can. And very typically, that is how research is done in psychology. If you look at a lot of studies, you'll see that many studies out there make use of Psych 111 students. Now, why do they do that? Because Psych 111 students are kind of a captive audience, as you guys all are. And it's easy because the psych professors simply say, well, we're going to ask these students, make it a requirement for them to participate. And there you have it. But that's a convenience sample. And so the issue you have with that is, can you generalize to the general population? Well, the question Maddie asked, you can't. There is going to be more bias in that sample, right? Why? Because not, particularly at BYUI, not everybody takes Psych 111, right? traditionally, there have been certain majors that are required to take this class. It's now part of the general education, but it's only one of several classes that could be taken. And so we don't get every single student or every type of student through Psych 111. In fact, what we would find is that a sample of Psych 111 students at BYUI would be heavily weighted towards nursing majors, social work majors, psych majors, med school bound students, physical therapy school bound students, because those are the kinds of students that are required to take an introductory psych class. We might not have very many mechanical engineers. We may not have very many, history majors. We may not have very many business majors. I don't know of how many of those groups that require 111. So yes, as Ethan says, your generalizability goes way down. Now, having said that, we want to say, well, why on earth would you then do convenient sampling? Well, because it's convenient, because it's really, really hard to get the names of everybody in a sample. Like I said, if I really want to generalize to all adults, all married adults in the United States, or all married adults in the United Kingdom, or all married adults in Venezuela, I've got to get all the names of all those people. And then I draw their names out, and then I've got to get them to agree to participate in my study. I mean, that's a step that I haven't even talked about yet. You get the names, then you got to get them to actually do the study. From a practical standpoint, random sampling and systematic sampling are hard to do a lot of times with the kind of research that psychologists do. Not as hard with a poll, which is a little different, but often hard with the kind of research that we might want to do. But sometimes that's as good as we can do. And so what we do then is we recognize that the generalizability is compromised. And what we hope is that other people are out there doing similar kinds of studies that will add to our understanding of this thing. So the idea is I'm here at BYUI doing my little study on seat preference and personality, and hopefully somebody else will read that study and say, gee, I wonder if that applies at Stanford University, and they'll do it at Stanford. And then someone will do it at Illinois State University, and somebody will do it at the University of Florida. And then if more and more of those studies are coming up with similar kinds of results, that allows us to start to conclude that, yeah, these results hold true across different populations. But it's got to be done with multiple studies. So, so convenient sampling, no, not a great way to generalize. In fact, you really can't generalize much, but sometimes that's all we can do. And if we wait until everything's perfect so we can generalize, we just won't do any research at all. So many studies just make use of convenient sampling with the idea that, yeah, this is not the definitive answer. This is one step to get us to that answer, hopefully. But it's, yeah, it's a problem sometimes. Okay, the last two here, I'll just mention briefly just because they sometimes pop up. Cluster sampling. This is where you actually divide your population into different geographical groups. So again, this is probably something that pollsters would be interested in. They might have a group called the Pacific Northwest and a group called California. I don't know if California is its own thing. A group called the Midwest, a group called the Eastern Seaboard. I don't know. But they would all have all these different groups. And what they would then do is they would select from those groups. So not trying to necessarily select randomly across the entire United States, but rather trying to select from these individual geographical areas and then putting your population, your subject sample together that way. So that is not true random sampling, but it's not, again, a bad approximation. It makes it a little bit more manageable to kind of do it in that fashion.
In
All right.
cluster sampling, are we choosing just one person from each group, or is it multiple?
It depends on the study. Yeah, it could be just maybe one or maybe several. Usually it's probably going to be several from each geographical area. Maybe a more sensible example would be if I was trying to do a study about opinions on something in Idaho. And maybe what I would do is I would want to make sure that I've got, again, some representation from all different parts of Idaho, because southeastern Idaho is very different than, you know, the Boise area of Idaho, which is very different from the Panhandle in terms of demographics in some respects. And so I might want to, again, deliberately select from those three areas to have decent representation, at least, of the, whatever it is that I'm trying to study. All right, the last one there is stratified sampling. And instead of trying to divide up your group geographically, you may be very deliberate in how you select certain qualities of your your sample group. So let's say that I'm doing a study and I want to have a definite proportion of men to women in that study. For whatever reason, maybe I need 2 men to every woman. You know, I need to have it set up that way. Or maybe I need to make sure that I have equal amounts, you know, both men and women. So what I would do is I would stratify. So I would have my men here and my women here, and I would select from those 2 groups based on, again, personal characteristics. So cluster sampling is based on kind of geographical areas. Stratified sampling is more based on the characteristics of the subjects themselves. If I wanted a good representation of different ethnicities in the United States, at least, then I might want to, again, deliberately select from individuals who are Native American, Caucasian, Latino, African American. I mean, I would want to do all that to make sure I have that decent representation. Because if I just select randomly, because of the proportions of ethnic minorities, I'm probably naturally, in some places at least, going to get a lot of white people. That's just kind of the way it's set up. And, you know, like Idaho, for example. But if I want good representation from those groups, I'm going to have to stratify. So maybe I want equal numbers of all the different ethnicities. So that's, again, just another technique for getting a sample that makes whatever conclusions you come to defensible. But again, it all depends on the purpose of your study and what you're trying to accomplish as to which approach to sampling you use, as well as your resources. As I said before, random sampling takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources to do. So it's not done that often. Neither is systematic sampling. What you're going to see is probably more the convenience sampling and then some variations on cluster and stratified sampling, at least in psychology. Probably different disciplines may look a little different than that. Okay, so that's, again, just some of the issues are surrounding generalizability. Now, I want to go back to, whoops, where's my thing? Here. Internal validity. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we call threats to the internal validity of a study. So I'm going to remind you, what do we mean by internal validity? What we mean is that there is an alternative explanation for the results that I got, not my hypothesized relationship with something else. All right, so these here are some it's not an exhaustive list, but these are some very typical threats to internal validity to be aware of. So I'm going to talk and kind of describe each one of these threats and hopefully kind of give you some examples of what that would be. All right, the first one there is development. Sometimes this is also called maturation. All right, so this is always a potential problem when you are studying children, because children change over time. So I had one of my professors back at Utah State University told me the story that he was sitting on the master's committee. He was like a substitute, actually. The individual who was usually on this particular student's master's committee couldn't make it, so he came in. And this young woman had been doing some work with an exercise program. So she had been working with young children, I think maybe 3rd or 4th grade, and had been running them through this exercise program. So she had them do exercises at the beginning of her study to see what they could accomplish, how many push-ups, how many sit-ups, that kind of thing. And then ran them through her exercise program and then measured those same things at the end. How many push-ups, how many sit-ups. And she found that those things did actually increase. But my professor found a problem with that because she didn't have a control group. What she had was just one group of kids that ran through the program. Now, it is very possible that, yes, her exercise program was responsible for those changes in those children's abilities. But it was also very possible that it was just natural development. As children grow and mature, their abilities change. And because she didn't have a control group, she couldn't really say definitively that the results were due to her program. It might have just been kids getting older. That's a development issue. That's the development threat. When you can attribute your results to just the natural development of the child, then that's a problem. Now, as you can see, you can counter this by having a control group. If she'd had a control group, a bunch of kids that did not go through the program and then measured and compared the two groups and saw changes, it would have been, again, a more justifiable conclusion. All right, so that's one problem to be aware of. And again, it's really only going to be a problem when you have kids, young children as subjects. All right, this next one is history. History is that usually, again, this is going to be an issue when you are taking doing a kind of a pre-test, post-test kind of study. By that we mean you measure something, you apply an intervention or you make an observation, and then you measure something again. Now, history means that there is some event that has occurred between the first and second measurement that may account for the change. So imagine that you are you have a new treatment for anxiety, okay? And you do a pre-test, you have a group of people, a pre-test, and you measure their levels of anxiety, you apply this intervention, and then you do a post-test, and you find that actually the anxiety has not diminished, but has actually increased. Now, one conclusion you might reach there is this program is not working. It's increasing the anxiety. But imagine this scenario. Imagine that the pre-testing took place prior to September 11th, 2001, and then the post-testing took place after September 11th, 2001. All right. Now, hopefully, at least the Americans in the class know the significance of that date, right? 9/11. Do you see what I'm talking about here? The increase in anxiety may have nothing to do at all with her program. It may, in fact, her program may have worked well if she hadn't done it prior to, a terrorist attack. But after that kind of an event, anxiety increased for everybody. It'd be the same thing if you were to try and do some kind of study like that right now. Why? Because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and anxiety levels have been shot through the roof as a result of some of the issues surrounding COVID. So that's a history effect. It has nothing to do with what you're studying, but it still has an impact on the results. And it's just, again, an event that occurred. You had no idea that it would happen, obviously. Now, again, one way to get around that is a control group, because if she had had a control group, or in this fictional study I made up, there was a control group, you would have been able to see more clearly if that had had an impact. The idea would be that maybe the individuals who had been through the anxiety program would have had less anxiety than those that didn't. But in any event, if you don't have that control group, it's very hard to make that determination. Okay, instrumentation. That particular threat to internal validity has to do with the instrument that you're using to measure whatever it is you're trying to measure. So let's imagine that what I'm trying to do is measure intelligence. I think I used the example of maybe a study of a drug that's supposed to increase intelligence. So let's imagine that I'm using a study to do that, and I'm using an intelligence test to measure how intelligence has changed. Well, but let's imagine I'm not using an intelligence test from 2021. Let's say I'm using an intelligence test from 1937. All right, that's a problem, because that test is so old, the norms are so old, it's probably not going to apply anymore to our current population. Lots of things have changed in the population in the last 80 so years. So that's an instrumentation issue, where the problem is not with any of the design that you're doing, it's the instrument that you're using is problematic. And that gets us back to, if you can remember, the criteria for a good measure reliability and validity. So if that measure you're using doesn't have that, that can be an instrumentation issue, okay? All right, the next one there is mortality. Now, what we mean by mortality is the loss of subjects during the course of the study. There was a while back, this is back probably when the internet was a little bit newer, a study done of a web-based instructional program. And the instructional program started out with about 161 subjects. And so the idea was that you would measure the individuals, their achievement, and then they ran through this web-based program, and then you measured their achievement to see if it had improved over time. Or you had a control group that you could compare them to. Well, it started with about 161 subjects. Only about 95 actually completed the entire program. That's not unusual for these kind of web-based things. So they didn't finish it. So they only had data on 95. Now you go, okay, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that when you have that many people dropping out of a study, those people who dropped out may have certain qualities that make them different from those that finished. And as a result, the results you get might be a little bit skewed. So dropouts from studies are always a problem, because remember, we haven't talked about this, but you're not compelled to be in a study. You can drop out of a study at any point in time. And so if you choose to drop out, then your results are no longer there. And who's left then? Well, in this web-based project, who might be left are those, I don't know, most comfortable with using the internet. It could be those that have a higher intelligence. You could be those that are more persistent. It could be maybe the men dropped out because they were too busy. The women dropped out because they were too busy. You don't know. But when you have a lot of dropouts, then that's a problem. That's what we mean by mortality. So it's not literal mortality, okay? Nobody's dying, though I guess sometimes that happens with some studies, but we're talking about they simply have dropped out and are no longer participating in the study. And so the results you get skewed to some degree. Okay, the next one there, selection. This is where a bias in your study results because of your comparison groups. I already made reference to this when we talked about random assignment. One of the problems, remember, I think I used the example of having a study where I have men in my experimental group and women in my control group, or if I have 18-year-olds in my experimental group and 30-year-olds in my control group, or if I have all, I don't know, all LDS people in my experimental group and Catholic people in my control group. If I get differences between those groups during the course of my study, it may have nothing to do with my variable of interest, but simply the inherent differences in those groups. That's why you do random assignment. You do random assignment to get rid of selection bias. Because again, we're looking for things that might account for the differences other than my hypothesis, other than my hypothesized variable. And then the last one there is called testing. And this is just what happens when you administer the same test multiple times. People may become familiar with it. And if they become familiar with it, then as a result, they may not be responding. The test is no longer measuring what you hope it will measure. So if I, for example, want to see how well students do on my test, my exam one in my class, so I give them exam one as a pre-test, and then a couple of weeks later, I give them exam one again. And let's say I say, oh, the scores aren't too great, so I'll give them exam one more time. You know, I do some more instructional finagling. I give them exam one. So you've taken the same test 3 times. By the time you take exam one the 3rd time, probably some of those items you know. And your performance on that test may not be due to my instructional manipulations, but just due to your familiarity with the test itself. All right, so all of these are, again, are potential alternative explanations. There are ways we deal with that. We know with testing, we We may, again, change our testing scheme. We make sure with instrumentation, make sure we have a current instrument that has good reliability and validity. With mortality, that's a tough one, but we just have to note how many subjects we have and how many have dropped out. And if we can, figure out if there is something unique about those that dropped out of the program. Okay, all right, with that introduction, we're going to go through some cases and see how well you can identify the potential threat to the internal validity of the study, okay? So we're going to be doing that kind of like we did it on Wednesday. So here's this first one. I'll go ahead and read it. Elementary school children who play chess regularly were found to average 10 points higher than non-chess playing children. The chess club advisor reported to the principal that playing chess results in higher IQ. The principal decided to make chess a mandatory subject for all students. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. I'll put the poll up. So there is a problem here. So which threat to internal validity do you think applies in this situation? All right, let's take about 20 more seconds. Just go ahead and make your best guess. Okay, let's go ahead. We'll put the results up here. There we are. Okay, so the threat that was selected most was selection followed by development. All right, selection is an issue here, most definitely. Can somebody tell us why? What's the problem? Why is this a selection issue?
Probably because smarter kids tend to play chess.
Okay, so smarter kids may be drawn to chess. We don't have a comparison group at all. Now, some of you put development, and actually that's not a bad guess just because we are dealing with kids. But with development, we're usually going to have multiple points of measurement in the study. And so as we move from point A, our pre-test, to our point B, our post-test after the intervention, we see a change, and that change could be due to just general maturation. All right, so yes, I can define selection again. Selection is that the group has certain qualities that are not related to the variable of interest. So in this case, what we're saying is elementary school children who play chess regularly were found to have high IQs. And the principal was saying, okay, what's happening here is playing chess causes high IQs, but there's no control group, right? There's just simply the one group. And so it could be that those kids who play chess are already very bright, maybe. And that's why they look so bright, but it has nothing to do with playing chess. It has everything to do with the qualities they already had before they ever played chess. So that's what makes it a selection issue. Okay, let's look at another one. All right, the value of supplemental calisthenics, that's exercises, to the physical education curriculum is being evaluated. Of the 500 students that are enrolled in an elective physical education course at a large high school, 50 were randomly selected to participate in an experiment as a single class. All right, so we have random selection here. Now, a randomly chosen 25 of these 50 students were held for 10 minutes after each class and put through a strenuous regimen of calisthenics, and the other half of the class was excused. So we have this kind of random assignment now. 25 are selected randomly, are doing the supplemental calisthenics, and the other 25 are not. At the end of the semester, the two groups, supplemental calisthenics versus no calisthenics, were compared on several measures of strength, agility, balance, etc. One measure of strength, the average of the 23 students in the no calisthenics who completed the course was 104.79, and the average score of the 15 students in the supplemental calisthenics group was completed the course was 128.5. The researcher concluded that all students should take supplemental calisthenics. Okay, so if you want a hint here, the hint is the numbers of students in the two groups at the end of the study, okay? The number of the students in the two groups at the end of the study is kind of the important key here. All right, let me go ahead and I'll put up that poll again. All right, so what's the issue, do you think, here? Okay, yeah, let's go ahead. We'll stop the poll right there. There's the results. All right. I think a lot of you picked up on my hint. Yeah, the issue here is mortality. Mortality. Let me stop the results and just point out that. Notice right here, we started off with 25 in each group, okay? And then at the end, we had 23 in the no calisthenics, and we had 15 in the supplemental calisthenics. So 10 students have dropped out by the time the study is done. Now, the researchers concluding that all students should take supplemental calisthenics. But the problem here, right, is that, well, maybe the 10 that dropped out were not benefiting, would not have benefited. Maybe if they'd stayed in, we wouldn't have seen those differences. And maybe the 15 who stayed in were just already pretty fit anyhow. So that's where, again, mortality can become kind of an issue. All right, let's see, what's our time? All right, I have a few more here, but I think in the interest of time, if you want to kind of go through these, you can on your own when I put the PowerPoint up, and you can kind of experiment a little bit with that. And I do have the answers right there. So I did want to talk about, I'm going to have to skip over this, but I wanted to get to this one here before we ended today to make sure I get that covered. Some of the ethical issues in psychological research, because along with the methodological problems that a study can have, it can have ethical issues as well. Now, I don't know if you'll remember, but back when we talked history, I talked about John Watson, if you remember, and how he did this study with little Albert that was interesting from a research perspective, but from an ethical perspective, not too great. And of course, back in 1920 or so, when that study was done, there really were not ethical guidelines for doing research. Basically, researchers could kind of do whatever they wanted to do. And as long as they weren't, killing people, people weren't going to say too much about it. That all changed with World War II. Because during World War II, the Nazis had been conducting a lot of studies, and they had been doing some pretty horrific kinds of things with people, prisoners. Well, not so much with prisoners of war, but with like some of the Jewish people and other people that they had put in concentration camps. And so at the end of the war, they had the Nuremberg trials, and one of the parts of this trial was to put on trial some of the doctors and scientists who've been doing those kinds of research. And one of the defenses that they tried to make was, well, there are no standards. We don't have any universal ethical guidelines for doing research. Well, that was true. It didn't help them. They were still found guilty. But they said, okay, so they developed something called the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code was probably the first formal articulation of how to treat research participants. And there's some very ethical reasons why you do it, and then there's some practical reasons as well. But the ethical reasons are, you should be not doing harm to people. Now, from the Nuremberg Code, developed, at least here in the United States, a law that put in place what's called an Institutional Review Board, or it's an IRB is the acronym. The Institutional Review Board's responsibility is to review all research that is done to make sure that it is not violating any of the ethical guidelines about treatment of human participants. So if you are doing something that could be considered harmful to, even if the individuals would be willing to consent, right? If you're still doing something that's harmful, that won't pass the IRB. So for example, let's say you're doing maybe something that involves electric shocks, and the people that you get to come in and do the study are individuals who are pretty poor, but you're going to pay them a lot of money to participate in this study that could be potentially harmful. And they agree because they need the money. Well, that's not considered ethical. You're taking advantage of their vulnerable positions for research purposes. That kind of a study, if proposed, would never pass an IRB. So it's not about that you're willing to consent, is it ethical in the first place. But if you are willing to participate and it's not doing bad things, you still have the right to refuse, and you have the right to know what the study is about. And that's what informed consent means. Informed consent means that you as a research participant, and by the way, since you are all going to do this, you're all going to be given informed consent, because every study that's conducted here at BYUI goes through the BYUI Institutional Review Board. And that's why I feel very confident that you're not going to have to do anything weird or unethical or dangerous, because it's all going to be reviewed by the IRB. But one of the things the IRB reviews is the consent form, and that consent form has to do this. The consent form has to tell you what the study is about. It has to tell you what the benefits are of the study. And those benefits could be, again, maybe improved health, like if it's an exercise study. It also has to tell you, is there any potential risks to you in participating in the study? And it has to tell you what those risks are. Now, we don't have to have a study without risks at all, but the risk should not be more than what you would encounter in everyday life, all right? So it's okay to put some stress, but you have to be very clear about that. You have to be clear and say, listen, this study does involve some degree of stress or some degree of hardship, but nothing more than what you would encounter in everyday life. You go and work out in the gym, that's stressful on your body. If it's within those bounds, it'd probably be okay, as long as you're aware of it. I mean, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to have that experience, you don't have to. And you can refuse to participate. You can refuse to participate at any point. That's one of the things the consent form does, is it should lay out the fact that you can drop out of the study at any time you want. You're not obligated. Now, if some studies that are conducted do offer financial compensation to its subjects, if financial compensation is contingent upon you going through the study, well, then you don't get the financial compensation, but you can still drop out. There should be no other kinds of consequences associated with that. This is why I provide an alternative research activity, so that if you get into a study and go, hey, I do not want to do this, I don't like this, there's an alternative activity for you to participate in that you can still get the points. That is something that's dictated by the IRB, which is why it's there. So if you'd rather not do the study, you have that as an option. So yeah, you cannot be forced or compelled to participate in research, and that is something that is overseen by the IRB. Now, one little wrinkle on all of this is when deception is involved. I don't know. Traditionally, there's not that much deception involved in the studies that are conducted here at BYUI, and the deception, if there is any, is pretty benign deception. But there's some kinds of deception that can be much more problematic. If you're fooled into doing something that makes you look a little foolish or a little bit silly, that can be distressing. And so what's required, if there is some deception, and provided it, again, fits within the ethical bounds set by the IRB, is something called debriefing. And what is meant by debriefing is that you are told what the research was actually about. You're given that information. And again, if for some reason the study is very stressful, that there is some appropriate therapeutic help available if for some reason. I mean, again, most studies are not going to be dangerous, but like, for example, let's say you're doing a study on heart rates or something like that, and somebody has an undiagnosed problem, with their heart that they didn't know about, but they get into your heart study and they're doing these exercises and suddenly the problem manifests itself. Well, you have an obligation to have help there for them. So that's why, you'd have to have a physician attending, or at least a nurse attending some of these kinds of studies. But in any event, during the debriefing, you tell them what the study was really about. And you ascertain that they're okay, that there's not any bad reactions to that. And if there are bad reactions, then you have an obligation to do something about that. And again, studies here at BYUI are not going to be anything like that. Okay. All right, Cami asked if I was doing it and in the middle of the experiment I decided not to, would they still pay me? Probably not. Now, however, if they paid you at the beginning of the study, if it was set up that way, Cami, and they pay you, you don't have to give the money back, okay? I mean, that's just how they set it up. And maybe they're paying you just to come, and that's a risk that they're going to have to run. But if payment is contingent upon you completing the study, they don't have to pay you. But that should be very clear in the consent form. They should be able to say, okay, you're going to get $20 if you go through all the study. They don't have to give you that $20 if you drop out. But again, they don't have to compel you to remain either. So you don't have to. So yeah, that's kind of how it's set up. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, now another thing I wanted to mention just briefly here. There's not a lot of animal research that psychology is involved in, though there is some. But there are guidelines for animal research as well. And that is overseen by a committee called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. That's the acronym is fine. IACUC is kind of how we say that. So again, if you just know the acronym, you're fine. But there is also an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee here at BYUI that oversees all use of animals, not just for research purposes, but for any purpose. So for example, like if you had, well, our university doesn't have this, but if we had like a little zoo on campus, like a little petting zoo or something, the IACUC would oversee that. All zoos, for example, have IACUC regulations, but it all has to do with the treatment of the animals, and you have to put the animals in good, in good conditions. You have to make sure they get plenty of food. They have their temperature. So we have on campus, we have a rat lab. Where one of our classes is taught, so they get to work with rats. And in that lab, first of all, it's locked off, so not anybody can get access to it. And the room where the rats are is temperature controlled, and you have to measure how much food you're giving them. You have to be able to document that. There's a lot of documentation that comes. And that's because, of course, animals can't refuse, right? Animals don't have the ability to say no. And so the use of animals is very, very strictly regulated. Now, this is a controversial area, by the way. There's groups out there that are really not in favor of animal research. Again, I can't speak to that, but I can speak to the fact that the regulations that are there to make their lives as comfortable as possible. But the truth of the matter is that we can do things to animals that we can't do to humans. Animal research has been very useful to us, but animals I don't want to say animals suffer because you have to make sure their suffering is minimal. In fact, you could never subject an animal to just suffering just to see how they react. You have to minimize their discomfort as much as possible. But again, you can do things to animals you can't do to humans. But again, we do have regulations about that. Okay, very quickly, last thing. I want to make it clear that I have spent a lot of time this week talking about science, but that doesn't mean that I believe science can answer every single question that we might ask. I don't think it can. It can answer certain types of questions. All right, the scientific method that I've described is not appropriate for answering questions that really cannot be put to an objective empirical test. All right, so for example, ethics questions. Should scientists do research with animals? Okay, that is an excellent question. It's an ethical question. It's not a question that we can research and find the answer to via the scientific method. We can get people's opinions about it. We can get data on the impact on animals, but should they do it or should they not is not a question that we can answer with science. It's similar to like morality, all right? Is abortion morally right or wrong? Okay, that is not a question that science can answer. It can't answer those kinds of questions. We rely on other kinds of sources in order to answer that particular question. Religious beliefs. Is there a God? Is there not a God? I mean, again, we can answer some questions about religion, but the existence of a supreme being, regardless of your religious beliefs, is really not something you can put to an empirical test. I guess it depends on the claims that are being made. If there are very strict claims being made, maybe you could put those to an empirical test. But the existence of God, I don't think is something that can be explored via research. So we can answer certain kinds of questions, but not that particular question. And preferences. Is classical music better than country music? Okay, that's not an empirical question ultimately. Yeah, and so we can't determine that with an empirical test. We can see what the preferences are, but we can't with science necessarily determine which is better because it's a matter of opinion. Should I stay or should I go? Oh, I guess not. That can't be. I guess Alec, they can't do that either. I guess it depends on where you're going and maybe why you're going. Maybe. All right. Okay, well, we're done for today. We're done for the week. When we come back on Monday, we're actually going to be moving on to our next chapter, which we're going to look now at some more definite content areas, neuroscience. So we'll be talking about the brain, nervous system a little bit. So don't forget about the first field report that's due tomorrow.